Welcome to So True, and today's devotional is entitled Sick of It. We're going to base it on John 11 verses 3 and 4. Are you sick of being sick? Sick of doctor's visits? Sick of painful treatments? Sick of watching life go by? Sick of feeling weak? Sick of having been on the receiving end of people's sympathy for an extended period of time and feeling helpless? And sick of hopes raised and hopes dashed? The fact is that sickness is no fun whatsoever. But it is a fact, a stubborn fact. Because of Adam's disobedience to God's commands, death entered the world and disease with it. Romans 5:12. Ours is a world that groans beneath the weight of its fallenness and futility. Romans 8 verse 22. The Bible would remind us that life is lived under the shadow of death. We see that, don't we, in the famous image of Psalm 23 verse 4, where David tells us that someday we will transverse the valley of the shadow of death. Luke 1:79 talks about those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. As a result, sickness is a humbling and a discouraging reality. But here's what I want you to know. It doesn't have to be a crushing reality. The case of Lazarus reminds us that we can experience God's love in the midst of the things we hate about our sickness. In John 11, verse 3, which I referenced at the beginning, we read that Lazarus was one whom Jesus loved. And we can experience God's love in the context of illness and weakness and sickness. In fact, our disease, our disability, our impending death can be a means of knowing God's love and showing God's glory. John 11:4, in Lazarus' context, particular to him, Jesus tells his sisters that this sickness is not unto death, but it's for the glory of God. God's glory was going to manifest itself in the context of suffering and sickness. C.H. Spurgeon, whom we love to quote on this podcast, who ministered in London in England, was a great man of God, greatly used of God. His dates bracket 1834 to 1892. And yet to read his life is to discover that he suffered illness for a good portion of his ministry and died fairly young by any measurement. On one occasion, this great Baptist preacher wrote this: "I have suffered many times from severe sickness and frightful mental depression, sinking almost to despair." On another occasion, he wrote with an increased appreciation of the value of suffering in the hand of God, quote, "I venture to say that the greatest earthly blessing that God can give to any of us is health, with the exception of sickness." Now, that's an amazing statement. We almost want to take a double take on that. Spurgeon said that beside the blessing of health, sickness may end up being an even greater blessing. Spurgeon had found more sanctifying benefit in sickness than health. Spurgeon had learned valuable lessons in the school of suffering, and he would have not learned them as well elsewhere. His physical weakness had promoted his spiritual strength, almost, mirroring Paul's words, "In my weakness I know God's strength, and therefore I glory in my weakness." In running with the thought that sickness has its benefits, let's reflect for a few moments on some ways in which illness may prove to be beneficial. First, it causes us to reflect on our mortality and pushes us to number our days. A couple of verses come to mind, Ecclesiastes 7, 2-4, and in those verses, Solomon tells us it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all men, and the wise take it to heart. We learn something. We reflect more in the context of sickness and mortality. Psalm 90 verse 12 echoes that, right? Number your days that you might apply your hearts unto wisdom. And sickness has a way of just helping us recalibrate our lives, that we indeed must embrace life with its expiration date and live it to the full. In fact, the thought of death can be an elixir for life and what is truly important. I think a second benefit, we could argue, is the comforting doctrine of God's providence. We come to understand in the midst of our sickness that there are no accidents, only divine appointments, that what's going on in our lives has first come through the hand of God and been presented to us as a gift that we don't perhaps first perceive as a gift or a blessing. Ephesians 1:11. God is working all things after the counsel of his own will. Psalm 115, God sits in heaven and does whatever pleases him. And so we know that God is accomplishing good in the midst of our illness and the things that we consider bad. I love James 1, verses 2-4 in this context, where James says, here's what I want you to do. This isn't what you would do naturally. This is what you'll do supernaturally with the doctrine of providence, with a strong faith in a loving God. Count your trials, which would include sickness, would it not? Count your trial, your sickness, as a joy. The joy isn't in the sickness. The joy is in what the sickness produces. James talks about our trials producing maturity and a greater roundedness in our spiritual experience of Christ. Maybe a third benefit, that our tears and our sorrow and our heaviness of heart due to sickness makes us more sympathetic to those going through the same thing. This would be 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3-7, to paraphrase very broadly, where Paul basically says, the comfort that I have received, I've used it to comfort others, and he's encouraging the Corinthians to do the same. Whatever God puts you through and you learn the sufficiency of his grace and the incomparable nature of his peace, that you bring that hope and you bring that perspective to others, and you lift them up with that which has buoyed you through your times of troubles. God puts us through what we're going through to help others get through what they're going through. Don't waste your sorrow. Benefit from it and use it as a ministry tool to the benefit of the body of Christ. Fourthly, lastly, another benefit, it brings us to magnify the grace and the glory of Christ. Ugly sickness, debilitating illness helps us to appreciate the beauty of Christ and all the sorrow and this sadness that he went through in bearing our sin. Isaiah 53 verses 3-5 talks about the fact that he bore our griefs, or he bore our sicknesses and our sin and the consequence of sin and the penalty of sin. And so as you and I endure an element of the greater suffering that Christ endured on our behalf, in the midst of whatever ugly experience we're going through, are we not drawn, are we not attracted to the beauty of Christ upon the cross as he bears our sin and the consequence of sin, which would be sickness, so that someday we will be in a place and in a state of being where there is no sin and there is no sign and there is no crying. Christ is that glorious, and in our sickness we identify with his identification with us, and we see him to be the treasure that he is. And you know what? If your losses and your crosses bring you into a deeper experience of Christ and a greater worship of him as your treasure, as it did for Paul, right? Philippians 3 verses 8-11, where he basically says, I'm looking back on it all now. I'm happy to count the things that I've gone through as loss, because in the middle of my loss, I've come to see that I never lost Christ. I'll never lose Christ, and the benefits that Christ brings to my life will never be lost. What a treasure, what a glory. And therefore, if that's the cost of coming to appreciate that joy, then it's a cost worth paying. And again, as we've said before, we don't say this tritely. When you're in the middle of something, it's excruciating and it's painful and it's very discouraging. We're just trying to encourage you not to lie there, not to stay there, and perhaps to work hard by the grace of God to get to a place. It's an amazing thing, isn't it, what Spurgeon said? You know, one of the greatest blessings in my life is my health, besides, with the exception of my sickness. He came to see the benefit of his sickness and his illness, and we've just outlined 4 of those for you. And I hope that you'll ruminate on that and meditate on that, and it will be medicine for your soul and bring a brightness to your spirit.